Well, first of all, if you haven't seen the book yet, this is the book cover, available on Amazon.
Yeah, just anywhere you get books, Amazon.
Yeah, so good. I thought it would be good to start with just a little background.
Yeah.
So when you and I first met, you had just finished this article on Katharine Barnwell.
Yep.
And it was the cover story for Christianity Today in
Right.
October of 22.
Yeah, I think I remember emailing back and forth with you, like they might put it on the cover,
Yeah,
while I was interviewing here. Yeah.
And so then in the spring, though, it won an award for Profile of the Year
That's
from
right.
the Evangelical Press Association.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah. I always remember it's called the EPA, which of course sounds like Environmental Protection Agency. But yeah, Evangelical Press Association. Yeah. And so it won the Profile of the Year. They call it Personality Article of the Year. Anyone else will call it Profile of the Year in a different kind of magazine ranking. Yeah.
And so that led then to conversations with several different publishers. Then you settled on Broadman and Holman.
Yeah, so I knew that there was a book in this story, and I'd done probably 40% of the research for a full book. I always try to write in a sort of an iceberg way, right? You only get 7,000 words in a massive CT cover article, but I wanted there to feel like there was 40,000 under it. And so I had a ton of the research done, and I knew there was so much more to say. And so I reached out to a few literary agents I know, just 3. I just chose 3 literary agents, and I reached out, and Mary DeMuth, one of the people I first started reading when I wanted to grow in the craft of writing, as like a 22-year-old, she was one of the people I reached out to, and she said she'd love to represent me. So I went from regular guy to all of a sudden this Christianity Today cover story, and you guys were interested, and all of a sudden I had a literary agent. It was an interesting moment to kind of go to bed one night and then wake up the next, and
Well, what I want to know though is because like even in the preface to the book, you say this is the greatest missionary you've never heard of. So how did you hear of her, and what was so compelling that caused you to write the article and then the book?
Right, yeah. So I'll tell a little bit of a story from the preface, or maybe the first chapter of the book. And so if you've read it, so you'll have heard some of this before, but I was sitting at a Bible translation conference as a complete newbie, right? I had no background, no experience, and a kind colleague leaned over to me and she said, "Do you want to meet the Michael Jordan of Bible translation?" And so I looked to the hall's entrance, and I have this mental picture of who's going to be walking in, this Michael Jordan. And then this elderly British woman in her younger 70s kind of limps into the hall. And it was the only time in my life that I've seen this. It's like if Billy Graham walks into a room, like there's kind of a hush, and there's this almost temperature change that happens. And that happened then. Hi, Jude. That's my son. And this temperature change happened in the room. And all of these like C-level people, CEO, CFO, whatnot, that I wanted to impress, all sort of looked over to her, and over the course of the next half an hour, I kept an eye on her. They all went before her one by one, just to get some time with her. And I thought, the only way to show more honor would be to go and like bow before her, which of course would be inappropriate. And so already I knew like there is a story there, like who is this person? And then I was supposed to, about a year later, I got assigned to go train under her. But because of a terrorism incident, someone who was a few years ahead of me on the field had a hit put out on his life. And he was basically pursued throughout Nigeria. And then he had to run out of there. And so I got a call basically saying, you won't be going there now or anytime soon. So go find somebody else. Find a different trainer, find a different track, find a different entrance into missionary Bible translation. And so I knew I had lost much. I knew that she was a big deal, at least locally, right, within that world. And that sort of then stuck in my mind because I thought, well, here I had the chance to study under this sort of small g great. And then because I lost that chance and that influence stuck in my mind, I kept asking about her and kept wanting to learn more and reading her books and hearing when people talked about how they used to do things, and how they do things so differently now. And I realized at the center of every conversation was Katie Barnwell. It was like this Forrest Gump figure who was just sort of accidentally or on purpose at the center of every major change. And I realized that as this information came in, I realized that she was one of the sort of capital G greats, that she had a bigger story than a lot of these people's, these missionary biographies I had read growing up. She actually had a more influential story. And I thought, well, a Billy Graham or a Mother Teresa has lived and no one's telling the story. Someone needs to tell the story. So that's a bit of a meandering answer.
No, that's great. So a little bit more background for those of us who write or aspire to write. How did you go about getting all of the information? I know you had conversations with family members and Katie, and tell us a little bit about the process.
There's a few ideas. So when most biographies that we read are written about people who are already passed, and so then, depending on how recently they lived, you really only have some sort of archival material, written material, maybe film material if it's more recent. But whenever you have someone who's still living, then of course you have all kinds of different options that are open to you. And so it's not a hard and fast rule. You can write a biography of a living person without their permission, but it's just really it's kind of a foolish move, right? Like if they're still living, you really want to seek their approval, and then you have the open door, right? Because then you can spend months or weeks with them, interviewing them, and then they become the portal into being able to interview all of their family and colleagues, right? They sort of become the trust that then opens the door for all of your other interviews. And so I sought her out in the summer of 2021 just for a Christianity Today story. And she is pathologically humble. And so I remember being so careful in how I wrote the article. I couldn't let on at all that I was going to talk about the truth is how great her career has been. But if I would have led with that, she would have said no, because no attention can come to her. And so I really had to couch it in what God had done through her life and how Bible translation has changed because of her. So I asked for her permission, first, and then sort of like the frog in the water. She slowly had to she slowly had to get used to more and more exposure and more praise. But though it hurt her in a way to be so in the spotlight, she also recognized. She's a scholar enough to recognize that her story is different. It is special enough that it could bring encouragement to others. So she sort of regretfully kept saying yes, even though she liked me, she liked the process, but she was not comfortable with the attention. Yeah. That was, I have, of course, all the written sources. I have tons of interviews with people, but that fount of her basically saying yes to a kind of authorized biography was really the way in.
Yeah, so, great, great. Well, you referenced Billy Graham and Mother Teresa just a couple of sentences ago.
Yeah.
And you make this claim in your writing that you think she's perhaps more influential than even Billy Graham. Share with us a little bit, how you can make that claim, and if that's true, why is she so relatively unknown?
Right, so you might have to remind me of the second question as I go here. So when I first realized that she may be not just more, but much more influential than Billy Graham, I thought, Jordan, just stop it. You're not more influential than Billy Graham. You must be wrong, you must be mistaken, you're just getting too excited about this because it's your pet project, you must be wrong. But I just kept diving in and kept doing the research, and I realized I wasn't wrong. And that was the crazy thing to me. So here's where there's actually some receipts, there's some numbers to this. So Lifeway Research estimates that Billy Graham has somewhere between 2.2 and 3 million people over the course of his life that became Christian because of his ministry, right? So his preaching, his institutions that he started, like Christianity Today, he started that, which then ended up running Katie's story. So institutionally, he started all of these things, which will give him he'll have more influence institutionally than Katie. But in terms of the number of people who met Jesus because of his ministry, it's still absurd, but it's 2.2 to 3 million. Whereas Katie Barnwell, so there are 7,000 spoken languages in the world today, and fully 3,000 of them have either full or partial Bibles that are completely done according to her methods, her students, her trainees, her disciples of disciples of disciples. If you make a family tree of all of the Bible translators in the world, almost all of them go back up through various trainers all the way to Katie Barnwell, and they stop there. So that's already, think of all of the fruit that comes out of all of the hundreds of thousands of churches across the world in those 3,000 languages. It's really hard to count that, right? But there is something that's easy to count in that the Jesus film, when they started in the 70s, they went for the low-hanging fruit. These massive languages like Hindi and others that they had full New Testaments already ready to go. They just needed somebody to record them, dub them, put them in the Jesus film. And then after about 500 or 600 languages, they ran out of this low-hanging fruit, and they realized if they're going to not shut down, if they're going to keep going, they need to start originating translation work themselves. They have to go to areas where the language has never been written before, and they have to figure out, one, how to do an orthography, then two, how to teach locals to translate, and how do they do that well without being unfaithful to Scripture. And so they called up Wycliffe and SIL and Pioneer Bible translators and Lutheran Bible, they called up everybody. And no one wanted to partner with them because it was just too big. It was too risky. They didn't know what to do. And then, long story short, basically, finally, Wycliffe said, well, actually, we know one person who we think will take this on, and it was Katie Barnwell. So she goes over to the Jesus Film, and she completely rewrites their process from the ground up. And this is just insane. So she writes their whole process from the ground up, and their pace at which they do the translation and the dubbing of the Jesus Film ends up tripling. And what's so crazy about it is that it triples, but into languages that had never even been written before. It was still tripling in speed, whereas before they'd just been finding low-hanging fruit and New Testaments that were sitting collecting dust on the shelf, and that's what they were working with before. Now they're doing it all themselves and training locals and like originating translation work, and their pace is still 3 times as high. And so that's why all of these people almost speak of Katie in these hagiographic terms, because she really is amazing. So since the rewriting of their process, 400 million people have at least said that they have become, Christians after an initial viewing. Now, as a scholar, I'm a bit, that seems a little optimistic. Even if it's half of those, though, it's still 100 times more than Billy Graham. So through the Jesus Film, she might be 100 times more influential in terms of sort of conversion. That's a loaded word. 100 times more influential than Billy Graham. But then when you count all of these Bibles and partial Bibles across the world, all of the pastors that are preaching or Sunday schools that are teaching using the scripture that's come to them through her, all of her work, we're looking at a top 5 or top 10 missionary of all of Christian history. I'm thinking like you've got a St. Patrick, or a St. Thomas, and you have a Katie Barnwell. That's the level we're talking about, I think. Yeah.
Well, the second part of the question was, then why is she still unknown?
I know myself well enough. I was like, you're going to have to remind me. Yes, so I think we really equate influence here with celebrity, and it is true that normally, they not normally, but often they do go together. To be Billy Graham is to be really influential, but also very famous, right? Whereas she was maybe more influential, but because of her whole career was in essentially West Africa, it was all over the world, but that was her main focus. She wasn't on screens. She wasn't part of the evangelical industrial complex, going to all the conferences, and she wasn't on the screen, she wasn't on social media. And so she has no celebrity, even though she has more influence. And that's how I think she's just not really known.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
We mentioned the Jesus Film in her strategy, but tell us a little bit more about some of her accomplishments that really changed the way Bible translation is being done?
Yeah, good question. Okay, let's see. There's maybe a dozen, but I'll try to mention 4 or 5. So she is the primary reason that people that look like me are not the originators of Bible translation all over the world. So Bible translation, if you've heard, stories from your church when you were young, or if you've heard, read a few biographies of Bible translators, it used to be like this white Western person like me would sling in, Indiana Jones style, and be like, hey, tribe, I'm going to learn your language for you for 10 years, and then I'm going to translate the New Testament for you, and I'm going to teach you how to read, and then I'm going to plop this New Testament down 25 years later. And it was almost this slogan. It was one couple, one tribe, one couple, one language, one New Testament, one lifetime. That was sort of how Bible translation worked. And there are only a few places in the world where that actually makes sense. So if you are in a monolingual tribal area, like deep in the Amazon, where they don't speak Portuguese as well as their tribal language, or if you're in the highlands of Mexico where they never got conquered by Spain, if they're still speaking their Mayan dialects and Mayan languages, those places it makes sense to do that. But almost everywhere else it doesn't. And so Katie gets to Nigeria and she realizes these people are trilingual, pentalingual. Many of them have master's degrees, whether it be in business or accounting or something else. I mean, these are very educated people. They just need a little bit of reorienting and training, and then they can do 80 or 90% of the work themselves to translate the Bible into their own language. But of course, you wouldn't expect them to be Greek and Hebrew scholars. So what they need to do is just pair themselves with a scholar. They can do almost all of the original drafting work, and then they just need to work with a Bible scholar for help. What is a Levite, right? And why is this, what is propitiation, right? Let's talk about this term because we don't have it in our language, right? Just like our English-speaking ancestors didn't have that word. We just kind of robbed it from Greek through Latin. But you have to find words for this in other languages. So she is the primary reason that the baton passed, because she basically realized you can train nationals or indigenous people all over the world to train, and she then wrote the book on how to do it. And for 50 years straight, it has been the not only primary, but almost the only resource for training Bible translators all over the world. It's gone through 4 editions. and it's still, to this day, the most used training manual, which I think would put it in, given there are 3,000 translations that are coming out of this method, it would make it one of the most influential books in human history, that you've got 3,000 Bibles out there that all go back to her training, which is codified in that book. So that's one thing. She invented the cluster model, where she realized that she spent about as much time training one language how to do translation work and then helping them, as she could then do the same with 6 languages at the same time, or 10 or 12 or even 20, as long as she could be in proximity with people. At some point it caps out, but she realized she could train about 20 or 25 language groups at the same time, and then they could all work together. So this is what she sort of invented. She would have 80 translators come to Jos, where she worked in Nigeria, and there would be maybe a handful that represented each different language around a certain area. So they'd all come together, and they could all talk amongst each other in various trade languages, right? Like Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, English, something like that. But then they all had their local languages that they spoke at home that might just have 100,000 people who speak that language, or 10,000 that speak that language. So they would all come together, and she would spend a month training them in how to translate, let's say, one book, right? So talk through all of the hairy problems in Luke, right? And so they dive in and start doing the work of translating Luke. And what she realized was so amazing is that she could train 25 with around the same amount of time it took to train one. And then what was really crazy, what she didn't expect, was that then they were all helping each other just as much as she was helping them. So one team would come up with an interesting solution in a tricky dialect for a certain sort of difficult phrase, and then they, through Hausa or Yoruba or whatever, would tell their neighboring tribes, hey, this is what we did with that, because we share a somewhat common ancestor in our language, and we did it like this. Would that work in your language? And then it would work, and they would all sort of share. So she was watching in real time the acceleration of Bible translation. So the pace didn't just increase linearly, but almost exponentially because of her First, she trained nationals to do the work, and then they were doing 25 at the same time and all helping each other. And so instead of 25 years for a New Testament, it might be 8, and you'd have 25 groups finishing it instead of 1. And so it's just gangbusters.
And so you also mentioned something in your book about software that's being used.
Okay, this is absurd. Okay, so there are about 10 to 12,000 people every day doing the work of Bible translation. Most of those people are like what you call nationals, right? So they're from another country and working in their own mother tongue languages. Maybe 1,000 or 2,000 of them are missionary Bible translators, but most of them are going to be nationals. And 95% of those people around the world are using 2 software programs. Both of them were either invented or deeply helped in the beginning stages by Katharine Barnwell, Katie Barnwell, even though she's never written a line of code in her life. She is so forward-thinking, and she has such a finger on the pulse of what is needed that she was at the genesis. She was the one kind of calling for these 2 software programs in the early 90s, that now there's not a single missionary Bible translation that you will find anywhere in the world not using these 2 programs. So one is called Paratext. It's kind of like the drafting program. So one person will be working on it. They've got biblical languages to the side, and it's one of those sort of, it'll send, receive in real time with scholars and people all over the world, right? So someone in Madagascar can be working on translating the Bible into their indigenous language, and you'll have scholars all over the world in real time getting these updates. And she was the one who saw the sort of potential and the need for this. Again, though she's not a computer person at all, she struggles to open a password-protected PDF. Like, she's not a computer person, but she knew that was needed. And then there's another program called Translator's Workplace, which is kind of like the library of for everyone around the world. She realized in the early 90s they were creating all of these great exegetical help. So imagine, she calls it putting the cookies on the bottom shelf. So if you've got all these translators all over the world that are trying to translate into their own languages, it can be really helpful for them to have more than a study Bible, but maybe less than a 1,000-page commentary on each book they're working on. Like, is there a sort of perfect middle ground resource that's queued for national Bible translators doing the work in their own language? So she and SIL and all of her colleagues started developing these tools. The problem was they were so good, but you couldn't get them to the field. It was so expensive. You got all these 500-page books. By the time you spent all the money to get them to the field, they would mold because they're bound in paper, and now you're trying to get by with them in the jungle. And so she looked around and thought, well, we have laptops now. It's the early 90s, the hard drive. It's the first time in human history that you could put more books on a device than a human being could read in a lifetime. Let's use it. So they started building these, or putting these books in like early sort of PDFs on hard drives. And then she realized what would be really great is to have access for when they need it to all of these great commentaries. And so one of the boldest things I've heard of in this book, she went to Erdman's, B&H, Zondervan, Thomas Nelson, all of these great Christian publishers, and basically just said, hey, these commentary series that you have that you sell for like $1,500 a pop? What would you think about just like giving them to us for free digitally for us to give to 10,000 people around the world just because they're doing good work? And they all said yes. It was just crazy. So every missionary Bible, in these Bible translators around the world, I did the math, they have a $53,000 library of some of the most, like the best commentary series we have in our library. They're all in my Logos program still, because they never took it away from me. But like, they're like all of these missionary translators, they have access to the best commentaries out there because the publishers just responded to this huge ask and they said yes.
Yeah, that's great. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I found interesting, or just like, oh, that's a good aha moment, was the value of Bible translation.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know the value of, helping people have scripture in their own language.
Right.
But beyond that, there's so many other values. I think you have a whole chapter called like Missionaries of Culture Change or something.
Okay. Yeah. So this has been fun to talk about, especially, there's people who, I think I was right on the tail end of this, where there was this really anti-missionary sentiment that went along with anti-colonialism, and a lot of that, of course, for good reason, right? There were many sins committed in the colonial era that needed to be repented of, right? But then there was this large overreaction where now, if you talk to most anthropologists today, they'll recognize that their ventures have been just as sinful as the missionaries that preceded them. And in fact, it was a big wake-up call for a lot of anthropologists to learn that the tribes they were working in much preferred the missionaries to themselves. So they're like, now if you go to an undergraduate institution, secular undergrad today, you won't have the same venom toward missionaries that like maybe I grew up hearing. But this isn't, so I like sharing this because a lot of people think, this is just a matter of people learning about Jesus or not. But what they don't realize is that learning or hearing the Bible stories and then the desire for literacy, it creates this entire cascade, which just about any secular person can really be all for. So there's this sort of notion out there that like missionaries sort of spoil unreached communities, and that's just ridiculous. So much more in the book on this, but logging companies, mining companies, corrupt politicians, a lot of people are, way before missionaries get there, a lot of these groups are already exploiting their own indigenous people, right? So wealthy businessmen in the capital of Nigeria want the resources and the mining, goods and the trees and whatnot in certain areas. And over, these indigenous communities are just getting completely used up by the haves of their own countries. They're seen as kind of backwater people. And the number one way to defend against being exploited like that almost always involves literacy, right? And then education in the mother tongue, right? So being able to go to school in your own local language, and then also learning how to read so that some people from your community can go off to law school and then come back and defend your own people on their own ancestral ground, right? That you could tell your own history, that you can guard your own ground, that you can know what your constitutional rights are, because just about every country in the world, people have a lot more rights than they're aware of. And so they keep getting abused and exploited because they don't know their rights because they can't read. And so when Bible translators go in, not only, of course, primarily are people coming to know Jesus, which is obviously amazing news, with learning that you are made in the image of God and just as worthy as the kings and senators from your country that have always treated you like you're a nobody, it is really hard to understate the culture change that happens when you realize that you are just as valuable as the senators who are exploiting you. It's like you can't get that kind of change. And then also, when they become literate and can defend themselves, you actually have preservation of culture. So I make the argument, I think a lot of anthropologists are starting to realize this, that SIL and Wycliffe, though secular anthropologists may not love what some of their goals are, they are starting to admit that they have probably done more to preserve culture than any institution in human history because of the massive, thousands of languages now have literacy now have written scripture. They have it, and then of course they're able to use that to write their own history. Education in the mother tongue. These things are really hard to overstate their influence. And then these communities can then defend themselves and keep thriving and surviving, rather than just getting washed up and absorbed into the main culture. Yeah.
Well, one interesting chapter in your book, I think, is titled CIA. And
Oh,
I think
yeah.
you were amused by that. The whole idea that missionaries maybe have been involved or been accused of being involved in spy work. You want to talk to us about that? Why is that so?
Yeah, so it's probably less so. Like if you're doing, orphan and widow care or education ministry, maybe it's not quite the same, but most people in Bible translation have PhDs. Most people could be making significantly more if they had stayed home. And so particularly Bible translators get tied in with these conspiracies about, are they actually intelligence agents, working for MI6 or the CIA? And it's because if you don't understand the gospel, it's hard to understand why people would do that, right? Like, wait, so you could be living in the UK in an endowed chair teaching linguistics at Oxford or Cambridge, but instead you're here, in what we've learned is this backwater, right? That our own people don't even want to come out to us because they think we're cannibals or whatever. And now you're here and you're getting malaria and some of you are dying and you're making, very little money, at least by your own standards. Like, why would you do that, right? And so if you don't understand the good news of Jesus, you have to find some sort of earthly reason why people are there. And when you can't find one, people's minds start turning. And they're like, well, what are all these highly educated linguists doing flying in from the UK? Well, maybe they're intelligence agents. So this has been a dogged rumor that just keeps following Bible translation around the world. It is from the 70s through the 80s, and this anti-colonial sentiment, it just really exploded. Now, sadly, this never happened in Bible translation as far as we can tell, but there were a couple of famous instances of some missionaries back in like the pre-Vietnam War era. There were some missionaries that were not connected to Bible translation that were intelligence informants for the CIA. And so it's, you have just enough truth to feed 1,000 fires. And so it was also, if you're one of these business exploiters who wants, one of the major trade languages to sort of take over, and you want all of these tribes to lose their identity, lose their land, lose their existence, so that you can go in and get those minerals or, mining materials or trees or whatever, it's in your best interest for the missionaries to get out of there. And so at some point or another, a lot of bad actors learned that one of the easiest ways to get rid of missionaries is to accuse them of espionage, because it's sort of like McCarthyism in our own history. You don't really need much proof. The accusation is almost enough for you to win, right? If you start accusing people of being communist or of being spies, you've almost won just by the fact that you've made such a leveling accusation. It's really hard to come back from that, right? And so in most cases where Bible translators are accused of being intelligence agents, they often end up getting removed from the country, even though there's never been any evidence. And I say in the book, as a scholar and a journalist and a regular hunter of skeletons, I like that phrase, a regular hunter of skeletons, the notion that you could keep 10,000 people around the world quiet with zero evidence. I mean, there's a number of scholars and journalists have spent their whole career trying to prove some sort of link, and they've never come up with a shred of anything. I mean, all the man hours wasted trying to find this connection that's not there. So that's why Bible translators all throughout history, or through the last 60 years, keep getting accused of being intelligence agents.
Something else that I learned, when I was a teenager, we heard about the Biafran babies and the starving children in Biafra. I never realized that Biafra was really part of Nigeria, and it was part of the Nigerian Civil War. But Katie's life is very much tied in with that Civil War. You want to tell us a little bit about her experience with that?
Yeah, and then I'll just say this. The book is called Katharine Barnwell, and you hear me keep saying Katie just because that's what we all call her. Interestingly, her family calls her Rin because her younger brother could not say Katharine. He would just say Rin. So all of her family's communication is Rin. Anyway, Katie is always what I call her. She went to Nigeria in 1964 and was there for about 3.5 years. And then the southeastern part of Nigeria, they found oil in their region, and then just culturally, the UK or Britain is famous for drawing terrible lines on their maps, right? It seems like half of the wars since British colonialism have been fought because the lines are not in the right place, right? They split people groups right in half, and they cause all these issues, and that happened in Nigeria. You basically have a Christian south and a Muslim north, and you have three massive people groups, the Igbo, the Hausa, and the Yoruba, all sort of competing to be the most impactful people group of the country. And so they all, though they inhabit one geographical country, they don't see each other as allies. And so this is kind of this powder keg, always ripe for civil war. So the Southeast called itself Biafra at the time, the Igbo people, plus a lot of other people, but that was the massive group there. And they wanted to pull away and have their own country. So after 3 or 4 years, this happens while Katie and her partner Pat were working there. And a lot of Westerners got out right away just because, civil war is coming, right? A lot got out, but they decided to stay. At the time, the intelligence they had was that, well, maybe the war will end quickly. It was kind of, the writing was on the wall that the Biafran area did not have the soldiers or the manpower to really, they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the jets, the military, they wouldn't win. So everyone thought, well, maybe this will be over in a month or two. We'll just stay and keep doing the work. But then what happened is they stayed, and it just kept escalating. And the rest of Nigeria put a blockade around Biafra, and that's why it was so devastating. 2 million people died of starvation, mostly children, because of their lack of access to protein. A lot of the children starved to death, basically. And so because of these blockades, all of a sudden now all communication was cut off. So Katie and her colleagues could not communicate with the UK, where they were all from, for more than a year. Their families didn't know if they were alive. SIL Wycliffe did not know if they were alive, and they had no access to get funds from the international, bank wires anymore. So all of a sudden, they're in an agricultural community, and they have no access to then go get, go to the capital or whatever to get more money. So they start to starve, right? And then they had helped this Nigerian community for so long with the meager, medical ability they had helped save lives and bring people to the hospital. And so then now here they are starving, and the Nigerian community around them is keeping them alive during this civil war, which is a really beautiful picture. Eventually, the war literally comes to them. There's planes and bombs and helicopters coming over, for these tribal people who'd never seen more than maybe a dirt bike, and all of a sudden there's helicopters coming over and bombs. And finally, Katie and her partner, 40, 50 pounds emaciated by that point, all had to flee. But if you're two white women in the middle of a Nigerian civil war, you don't just want to walk into the invading armies. So they have to flee by river into Cameroon, and so they take a 5-day flight, essentially a 5-day pontoon trip, walk in pontoons and canoes. These sort of rigged. They would put 2 canoes together with planks to make a kind of rigged pontoon. And then they were able to escape into Cameroon without documents, but the Cameroonian border guards let them in. So that's how they were able to escape. Yeah.
I wonder, is there some story or anecdote or piece of information that you didn't include in the book that you're like, I really wish I had written that or included that?
Yeah, there's so much. There are so many great examples of what Katie taught in her books. But I had, they wanted a 9-month turnaround on this book, and I laughed at them. I'm like, this is a biography. Like, I can't do this in 9 months. I asked for 15, and they gave me 12. And so I had less time than I wanted, which is okay. I still wrote the book I wanted to, but I would have liked to bring in more examples from her own writing. That would have been nice. There were other details about her immediate ancestors that would have been nice to put in. She had come from an actually pretty privileged line of people. Now, it's hard to tell that story, right, because people might lose sympathy for her, but her family had sort of lost, a few generations earlier, they had been wealthy and in the nobility, but then through sicknesses and deaths and whatnot, they had sort of found their way into the middle classes by the time Katie was going to college. And it would have been nice to tell that story, but I didn't find a way to do it with the time I had that wouldn't, all of a sudden if an American reads like, oh, her ancestors were wealthy, it's like, well, who's this lady then, right? And so I didn't find a way to tell it well in the time I had.
Yeah. So how is the book being received now? It's been out about 2 weeks.
Yeah, so it's being received well. The reviews are great, and you don't really know how it's selling in terms of numbers until like a full quarter goes by. Like they keep that stuff really locked up. But what I have is a proxy for how it's selling. So Amazon will show you the overall rank of your book in the bookstore. And so I have this proxy, and I visit in the top 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 sales. And I don't even know what those mean. But my agent said, as she's looking at it, she's like, oh, she's written 30 books herself, and she thinks it's selling really well, and that it's got, she can tell there's some word of mouth thing, because the numbers stay the same, whether there's ads or no ads, or there's a big review or no review, the numbers keep staying the same. Yeah. So that apparently is a good sign, but I have no idea.
So, I mean, have people reached out to you? Have you heard from anyone else about the book?
Yeah.
Any other interest? Or?
Yeah, I certainly have heard a lot of people, first in missions and people who care about, reading about missions, have just been thrilled with the book. But there haven't been a lot of, like the major magazines and missions journals, they're working on their reviews, but no one has them done yet. Because normally they assign them, then they give a month, and then they have to edit them, and so it's still, I haven't seen those yet.
Yeah. But I know you have an invitation to go somewhere next month.
Yes. Oh, right. Yeah. Thank you. I was like, where? The 700 Club actually invited me on, which I remember growing up, my dad always watching that program. Yeah. And so, they're going to fly me out, and I'm going to be on the 700 Club. Yeah. So that'll be fun. There's been a lot of podcasts, little radio shows. Sure. Moody Radio that syndicates all over the country has had me on. But yeah, the 700 Club will definitely be the sort of the pinnacle of the PR campaign. Well,
so I'm sure Katie has read the book.
Actually, not yet. She has better things to do. That's how she is.
Okay.
So she really liked the article. It took me a full year to figure this out. She's so shy that she was kind of embarrassed, right, and didn't know how to handle the attention. But when I did go to her place, I spent a week with her to interview her for this book, and she had right on her main sort of table in her living room, she had a copy of the magazine, which tells you a lot, right? This person who's kind of shy of being in the spotlight has the cover article of herself right there. So there's a level of pride there. You don't keep that around if you don't want your visitors to talk with you about it, So she was up for the book, but she is actually, this is a beautiful end to her story. She started with this small people group called the Mbembe in southeastern Nigeria. So she started in the old model. Before she changed everything, she had to learn how the original old model worked. So she was working with people, translating the New Testament with them, and realized very quickly that she should be training them. So she was sort of learning this on her first project, and ended up producing this New Testament with local African believers. And then, because everything she touched turned to gold, they just couldn't promote her fast enough. And soon she was the head of all of Nigeria, then she was the head of all of Africa, and then she became the senior linguistics, international translation coordinator for the whole world. But she would take Christmas vacation. She'd take 4 weeks and go back and spend it with the Mbembe for Christmas. That's where she was single for life, and that was her life. So she would break from Bible translation just to go back and spend it with this community. And so now, in her old age, she's 86, still working full time today, and she was making trips regularly to Nigeria. But then with COVID, she has pretty bad arthritis in her hips. And it was already quite hard to go. And then with COVID being kind of stuck in England for a couple of years, that was a good break for her to just say, all right, well, I'm going to stay planted here. But she is on Zoom every day, probably right now. It's like 9 p.m. or 8 p.m. in England. She's probably on Zoom right now with her African colleagues, because they are now working on 3 different dialects of the Old Testament in the same languages that she initially started in. Mm-hmm. So at the end of her career, she realized she didn't want to have a stroke or a heart attack while she was over 20% of the work of their organization. A brief sidetrack: the seed company that she worked for, part of Wycliffe Bible Translators. At one point, she oversaw 20% of their overall workload in the world, and they're the 5th largest mission agency in the United States. And she was not just overseeing it, but doing 20% of their workload. And she realized she did not want to sort of die in the saddle and leave all of that for everybody else to pick up the pieces. So she has been slowly kind of coming back down the ladder. And then this beautiful story has found her, where the grandkids of the original Mbembe translators said, well, we've had the New Testament now for 50 years, but what good is the New Testament without the Old, right? It's a machete without a handle. It's a tree without roots. We want the Old Testament. And we hear that this famous translator who worked with our grandparents, who are all long past now, but we hear that the translator is still alive, this British woman. So they reach out to her, and she ends up getting back involved in her initial project, and they're working on 3 Old Testaments now. Wow. Yeah. So that's why she has not fully finished the book. I think she's poked through it, but she's just like, I'm working on the Old Testament. I'll see if I get to the book. Yeah. Which is so her. I mean, it's her all the way through. If you read the book, you get these little snippets of her personality, and just how it's not that she's that she thinks lowly of herself, but like, C.S. Lewis says, right, that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking so, infrequently about, thinking less often about yourself or whatever. And that's her. She seems almost like a saint in like the classic description of the saints. She's just so focused on Christ that she doesn't really seem to even consider herself in a way. Yeah.
There's only one thing I read in here that made me question her a little bit.
Okay.
I think Aubrey would probably agree. She said that you are really good at living.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. Katie has lived alone since the 70s. She had this partner, Pat, who ended up getting married off. And since then, she's lived alone. So when I was at her place, she struggles with this limp. She has arthritis, and so she'd be kind of walking with her walker, and there'd be something in the way. So I would quick jump up, and snatch it. Or I made food for her a few times. I did her dishes a few times. And I don't think she's had a lot of colleagues, but she's not had someone around to like do the dishes, So she turns to me and she says, I won't do the accent, but she says in a very British, proper accent, she said, "You're very good at living." And I was like, what? What is that a phrase? I'd never heard it before. So I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, you're very good at knowing what needs to be done and then doing it. And then my next line was, well, my wife may tell you otherwise. And this is my wife, Aubrey, back here. Can I tell the story about you in the car? Sure. Yeah, so Aubrey was just listening to the book. And when she got to that part of Katie saying, you're very good at knowing what needs to be done and then doing it, she said she laughed out loud because, she sees the other side of me who needs to be like reminded sometimes what to do. So she laughed out loud, and then it was this weird meta moment where then the next line is, oh, my wife may tell you otherwise. So she's in the car laughing and then hearing me say that, realizing like, oh, we're almost having this strange meta conversation. And so I say, whatever I do, whatever help I did bring to her is just probably because I learned it from Aubrey. So, that was kind of beautiful, but also sad that she's not had, like, for her to think that I'm ridiculously helpful shows that she's not really had someone else around who actually is helpful, Yeah.
I'm sure it was a blessing for you to be there. No. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I wonder if anyone here has a question. We can entertain a couple of questions if you have them. Otherwise, you can chat around the cookie table out back. Anyone have a question for Jordan right now?
Yeah.
What's the difference between Wycliffe and Seed Company?
Yeah, good question. So the Seed Company originally started as an R&D innovator within the Wycliffe world. It was never meant to be its own but it was never meant to be its own translation agency. It was meant to solve the problem of how do you fund indigenous translators. So Wycliffe had this way for people who look like me to get funded. And then all of a sudden they realized, because of Katie's work, that we need to be paying, not just asking for volunteer hours on the side, but actually paying thousands of national translators to do the work of Bible translation in their own languages. But there was no real funding apparatus. So you had all these Westerners trying to over-raise extra support and then pay nationals out of their own support account. It was just a mess, right? Like say you had to raise $4,000 a month, then they might try to raise $6,000 and then pay some of the extra to others. And the Seed Company was started basically to figure out how do we projectize Bible translation. Like a business will put project funds toward all of their different endeavors. They'll say, okay, we've got $2 million for this project. Now we'll figure out how to parcel that out. So the Seed Company figured out how to, essentially they brought in a bunch of people from Fortune 500 companies who were believers. And they said, we don't know how to run project development and project financing. Why don't you figure this out? So they brought all these business people in and they projectized Bible translation, which is also one of the reasons it was able to expand and increase. But here's the problem. They innovated so quickly that even though Wycliffe and SIL took some of the goods that they were sort of coming up with, they didn't take them fast enough. And so much money was coming into the Seed Company that they couldn't spend it fast enough. And so they were like, well, let's just start a translation wing. Let's actually start sending translation work instead of just trying to send money to people who are doing it. And then they ended up becoming one of the big players almost overnight because of their innovations. Yeah.
Okay. Becky.
You mentioned that SIL had a training center, where was it, North Dakota?
Yeah.
UND, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was going to grad school, I actually thought I'd entertained the idea of going to their summer institute, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned that they were one of the last, like, sort of vestiges of the old guard.
Yep.
And that it had recently, and I got online and I was like, oh yeah, they had shut down.
Yeah.
They recently shut down their program. Are there places in the U.S. now where SIL has these trainings for people that use the newer methodology, or was that the only one in the U.S.?
Right, yeah, so they do have a major training still in Dallas. They had one in Oklahoma, they had one at UND in North Dakota, Dallas, and then all of them have kind of consolidated into this one. Now it's much more ad hoc. So originally you had to do a Master's of Applied Linguistics all up front, and then you went on the field to like do the work, whereas now it's much more like, let's have you take these 4 courses and then go spend 2 years on the field, learning kind of like a junior blacksmith will learn under a senior one, Let's have you, kind of apprentice. And then after a couple of years, then you come back and do another slate of courses, and then you go back out. And that's why there aren't as many big institutional schools anymore, because you're kind of hopping around the globe, taking courses here and there while you do the work. Yeah, but I had done my linguistics training at, like you said, the last vestige of the old guard. And I stepped into what I thought was this like current debate, but really they were they were rejecting Katie's method and trying to do it the old way. And I thought that then this was still a really active debate. And it took me a while to learn, oh no, they're just stuck in a linguistic cul-de-sac 30 years in the past. And the whole world had moved on, except for a couple of branches in Latin America. So Mexico branch, Peru branch, and a few others were like, no, we're going to keep doing it the way that Uncle Cam, William Cameron Townsend, who started Wycliffe, we're going to do it the way he did back in the 1930s, because that's the right way. And so they kind of held on to their own little world. And then, there's only so many monolingual small tribal groups in the world, and the need kept running out, and everyone kept seeing, every funder was like, okay, do I want to pay these people to spend 30 years producing a New Testament that maybe no one will read? Or do I want to spend, my millions on this company, which in 30 years will produce, 15 New Testaments in languages that have 1 million people or more? Well, so all the funding started going away, and so it created this whole thing, and then the school closed. So.
Any other questions? Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Join me in thanking Jordan. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted just to say thank you guys so much for hosting this. If you're interested in buying a book, I wish I could have had like a whole box full here to sell, but that's just I didn't have enough author copies, so you'll have to buy your own book. I'd love to, if not that you want my signature, but some people have, and if you want, I'd love to sign it or endorse it or whatever. But I appreciate that. Sorry, I don't have a box here for people to buy.